And I do want to take you back out to this live image that we do have over Lebanon at this hour as we get to the latest on the situation unfolding there. President Biden says the U.S. will not support an Israeli strike on Iran's nuclear sites in retaliation for this week's major attack. Over the course of an hour Tuesday, Iran launched 181 ballistic missiles at Israel, believed to be the largest ballistic missile attack ever. Israel's prime minister threatened retaliation, saying Iran, quote, made a big mistake firing a barrage of about 180 missiles at Israel and, quote, will pay for their actions. At the same time, Iran's U.S. ambassador warned Israel that its response to any acts of aggression against Tehran, quote, will be swift, decisive, and stronger than before, as Iran calls Tuesday's attack an act of self-defense. A lot here to discuss, so I do want to bring in 𝐴𝐿_𝐸𝐿𝐿, the Deputy Director of the Washington office of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, also the author of The Iran Threat. Thank you so much for taking the time, as always, to be here with us today.
Thank you so much, Josh. Always a pleasure to be on your show.
All right, so first off, my big question here, and this is kind of a big one. What is Iran's end game overall? You have this major attack, the largest ballistic missile attack really ever. What is the end game?
Well, as far as the Ayatollahs ruling Iran are concerned, they just basically want to stay in power because they are in deep trouble. What you've seen over the past few months is actually a projection of power by the Iran regime to make the world believe that the Ayatollahs are 10 feet tall, they have all the power, they have all the proxies. It's all done to cover a very deep-rooted weakness inside the country. The regime is facing a discontented population that has called for change. The regime is engulfed in corruption. And that's why they're relying on the proxy forces, whether it's in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, and you name it, the whole region. That's a strategy of survival. Remember, in the backdrop of that, there were 9 rounds of major uprisings in Iran since 2018, when people in all 31 provinces of Iran protested against the regime, calling for change. And the regime had to resort to sheer violence and executions and killing people on the spot, arresting them and jailing them in order to temporarily put down the revolt. And the concern of the Ayatollahs is that there's going to be another restart, reemergence of the uprisings, and they may not survive the next round. That's why they're heavily relying on these proxies. That's why you see all these missiles being fired and, left and right. This is all just designed for that purpose, and I hope the world understands the vulnerability of the regime in the midst of all of these attacks.
And what I did want to ask you overall is we talk about the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah. Does that really mean anything to Iran overall? Do they care that much, or is it more of an excuse, I guess, to launch this kind of attack against Israel? Is it kind of in the middle somewhere?
Well, remember, what's really happening in the region is a clear indication that the head of the snake of war and terror lies in Tehran. And that's why when the regime or its proxies are receiving blows, that's serious for them. The elimination of Hassan Nasrallah was clearly a major blow to the supreme leader Khamenei and the regime as a whole. It was also the fate of Nasrallah is also a reminder and a proof that the biggest grand loser, strategic loser of the developments in the region is Khamenei and the regime in Tehran. They are the ones who have been behind much of the terror and warmongering in the region, and they're paying the price for it. Hezbollah, of course, among all the other proxies, has played a key role for Tehran. It's not even comparable to any other groups in the region. It's entirely relying on the regime in Tehran, both in terms of training, finances, and, over 3-4 decades. And they did most of the dirty work on behalf of the Quds Force of the Revolutionary Guards. Look at Syria. Hezbollah played a key role on behalf of Tehran to keep the Syrian dictator Assad in power. Look at the situation of the Houthis in Yemen. That a lot of the trainings that the Houthis are getting, they get it actually in Lebanon by the Hezbollah on behalf of Tehran. So when Hassan Nasrallah, who says we get everything from Tehran, he said when Iran has money, we have money. He said that even the clothes that they had on, in addition to everything else, the equipment and training, all come from Tehran. So when the regime when Hassan Nasrallah is eliminated, that's a big blow to the Iranian regime. And of course, they have to save face. They have to, to do something to show to their own forces that they're not under, constant barrage of attacks. They make acts here and there, which actually comes from the nature of the regime. But none of them are going to really save this regime.
My last question for you here. I want to talk about the nuclear threat from Iran overall, because we've seen their, I don't know if you would say stockpile, but their resources, the threat overall kind of rising over the past several months. What do you make of that? Is that a threat to the U.S., to Israel, to other countries across the world?
Well, the nuclear weapons program of the Iranian regime, in parallel to their support for terrorism, is actually part and parcel of the strategy of the regime to survive. Their survival strategy is 2 pillars: repression inside the country, export of terror, development nuclear weapons and missile program abroad. That program, unfortunately, has advanced over the past 2 decades. We were the ones who first exposed the nuclear sites in August of 2002 that triggered for the first time the inspections of Iranian nuclear sites by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. But unfortunately, the outside world, instead of holding the regime accountable, instead of trying to prevent the expansion of the program, which was in the very basic steps in 2002, they just gave concessions to the Iran regime. They legitimized the Iran regime's program. They allowed them to expand. And allowed them to, basically kick out inspectors and making some sites off limits. It's gotten to a point that, this has become a serious threat. They have near weapons-grade enriched uranium. They have an advanced weaponization part of the program that has basically been off limits. And that's why I think the real solution to end both the threat of terrorism and the threat of the nuclear weapons or the missile or drone program of the Iran regime is basically to focus on the head of the snake, which is regime change by the people of Iran. And it's, and it's very doable because, as I said, there is a, discontent population. But on top of that, there is an organized opposition. There is an alternative to this regime that has been fighting the Ayatollahs for years and have been undermining it. That's the main preoccupation of the Iran regime. The regime can survive pressure, they can survive sanctions, but what they cannot survive is their own population. And they want the outside world not to look at that direction. And that's why I think it's so important for the United States, for Europe, for all the Western nations and the countries to craft a new policy regarding Iran, that the central element of that policy would be accountability for the Iran regime, but also supporting the regime change by the people of Iran, as we have seen in the protests all over the country in the past. That's what you really need to do. You need to think about the solution, a long-term solution that would eliminate the root cause of all of these terrorism or the threat of the Iran regime, and that's regime change by the people of Iran. And, it doesn't matter what the regime does. They get a new president, just came to New York last week, preaching to the world about peace. but there were thousands of Iranian Americans who were there, making it very clear to the world and to the regime and whoever was there that this regime doesn't represent the people of Iran, that regime change by the people of Iran is the solution, and that there is an alternative with a clear platform known as the 10-point plan introduced by a female leader, Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, that calls for separation of religion and state, ballot box as the only criteria for legitimacy, gender equality, freedom of religion, free market economy, peace in the Middle East, and a non-nuclear Republic Iran. This is the platform that has the support of the majority of the members in the U.S. Congress, in addition to some additional 4,000 parliamentarians around the world. That's where the administration, whether the current or the future administrations, will have to focus. Listen to the elected representatives of their own parliaments and draft a totally new policy regarding Iran.
All right. 𝐸𝐭𝐻𝐿𝐻, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here and break it all down. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Josh. Always a pleasure.